former Trump. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows reportedly offering damning testimony against the former president to Special Counsel Jack Smith in exchange for immunity. That's according to ABC News. Our chief legal affairs correspondent Paula Reed is gathering details for us. Paula, what can you tell us?
Well, CNN previously reported that Mark Meadows had testified before a federal grand jury investigating former President Trump. Now we're learning more about what he has reportedly told investigators. Now, according to reports, he's spoken with investigators 3 times over the past year, and he's told them that in the weeks following the 2020 election,
You're not just watching another routine legal hearing. You're watching the exact moment the wall of loyalty, a structure built over 4 years of silence, executive privilege, and political defiance, finally suffered a catastrophic structural failure. Tonight, the primary question isn't just about whether Donald Trump can continue to fight back against what he calls the establishment. It's about whether he can even remain in the same room to hear the truth being told by his own former right-hand man. Mark Meadows has just walked into a federal courtroom and done the one thing Donald Trump feared most. He stopped being a shield and started being a primary witness for the prosecution. The era of strategic silence is officially over, and the burn-it-all order is now a permanent part of the official judicial record. ABC News has recently confirmed a development that many in Washington viewed as the ultimate legal nightmare for the former administration. Mark Meadows, the former White House Chief of Staff, has reportedly provided damning testimony to Special Counsel Jack Smith in exchange for a grant of immunity. This is not merely a common legal maneuver. It is a political earthquake that threatens to reshape the upcoming election cycle. For more than a year, Meadows utilized every available legal resource to fight subpoenas and claim executive privilege in an attempt to protect the former president.
this is one of the most significant developments in this entire investigation. He is arguably the most valuable witness the special counsel has secured for their case, which is expected to go on next March. And again, when the January 6th committee on the Hill researched everything about the events leading up to January 6th, efforts to subvert the 2020 election, they concluded that all roads lead to Mark Meadows. So there have been questions, Wolf, swirling about exactly what he was doing.
However, after the Supreme Court ultimately stripped away those specific immunity claims, Meadows was forced to make a cold, calculated decision for his own future. He realized that personal loyalty to Donald Trump was no longer worth the risk of spending the remainder of his life behind bars. As Meadows stepped onto the witness stand in Judge Moss's courtroom yesterday, the atmosphere was described by onlookers as suffocating. This is the individual who was present in every critical meeting, on every classified phone call, and at the absolute heart of every major decision leading up to the events of January 6th. For months, federal prosecutors have maintained a public narrative that all roads lead to Mark Meadows. Yesterday, those roads finally reached their destination, a full-scale liquidation of the Trump legal defense strategy. The most chilling and arguably the most significant moment of the testimony occurred when the questioning shifted toward the infamous Epstein logs. For years, the public and international media outlets have speculated about the extent of Donald Trump's social connections to the late Jeffrey Epstein. However, Mark Meadows has now provided the first direct eyewitness account of an attempted cover-up at the highest levels of government. Meadows testified under oath that Donald Trump personally issued a direct and unambiguous command regarding the documents. The quote that is now reverberating through the halls of Congress was simple: "Burn it all." According to the official courtroom transcript, Meadows stated that the former president was highly specific about which documents needed to disappear. This included logs, internal communications, and any physical records that could potentially tie the inner circle to the Epstein investigation. Meadows further testified that Trump went as far as to make a direct phone call to Bondi, who was the Attorney General at the time, to ensure that this cleanup operation was handled with the necessary level of discretion and authority. The reaction inside the courtroom was immediate and absolutely unprecedented. As the specific details of the phone call to Bondi were being read into the record, Donald Trump, the current sitting president in this context, abruptly stood up and fled the courtroom. He did not simply walk out in an orderly fashion, he abandoned his own legal hearing in the middle of a judicial ruling. Judge Moss took the rare step of formally noting this departure for the official record, characterizing the exit as a fundamental disrespect for the court. The judge went as far as to label the move a tantrum, suggesting it speaks volumes about the former president's inability to face the testimony of his own chief of staff. With Donald Trump's national approval rating currently crashing to a historic low of just 31%, and a staggering 74% of the American public now reporting that they believe Mark Meadows over the president, the walls have not just closed in, they have been locked from the outside. The sudden departure of Donald Trump from the courtroom was not merely a reaction to being confronted by a former ally, it was a calculated response to the specific mention of a name that connects the former administration to a web of legal vulnerabilities: Pam Bondi. To understand why the burn-it-all order is so devastating, one must look at the mechanics of how that order was allegedly intended to be carried out. Mark Meadows' testimony has placed Bondi, the former Attorney General and a staunch Trump defender, at the center of a potential obstruction of justice conspiracy. This revelation has sent shockwaves through the Republican Party, forcing a moment of reckoning for leaders who have spent years defending the integrity of the inner circle. According to the testimony provided by Meadows, the phone call to Pam Bondi was not a casual conversation between political colleagues. It was described as a high-stakes directive issued at a moment of extreme legal pressure. Meadows testified that the former president viewed the Epstein logs not just as a personal embarrassment, but as a direct threat to his political survival. By allegedly ordering Bondi to oversee the disappearance of these records, Trump may have moved beyond the realm of political spin and into the territory of federal crimes. Bondi has already admitted to what she termed unlawful acts in separate related proceedings, and Meadows' testimony now provides the missing link: the direct involvement of the President of the United States. This is where the narrative shifts from a personal scandal to a constitutional crisis. If a sitting president uses the office of the Attorney General to destroy evidence in a federal investigation, it represents a fundamental breach of the checks and balances that govern the American Republic. Legal scholars are already pointing out that this testimony provides prosecutors with a clear roadmap for charges of witness tampering and destruction of evidence. Unlike previous investigations that relied on circumstantial data or filtered memos, this is direct eyewitness testimony from the person who sat in the room while the orders were given. The detail that Meadows provided, noting the specific dates, times, and the frantic nature of the communications, makes it incredibly difficult for the defense to dismiss this as mere hearsay. The political fallout from the Bondi revelation is already manifesting in the halls of Congress. For years, the GOP has remained a remarkably unified front, largely due to Donald Trump's iron grip on the base. However, the nature of this testimony is causing even the most loyal supporters to hesitate. Senator Thomas Massie, a prominent Republican voice, has publicly suggested that the party must begin to look toward a future that is not defined by the legal baggage of a single individual. This is not an isolated sentiment. Sources on Capitol Hill report that several key senators are quietly distancing themselves, fearful that the Epstein connection and the obstruction charges will become an anchor that drags the entire party down in the upcoming midterm elections. The data reflects this growing unease. When 74% of Americans state that they find the Chief of Staff's testimony more credible than the president's denials, the political math changes. A presidency relies on the perception of strength and the loyalty of the inner circle. When that loyalty is replaced by federal immunity deals and courtroom bombshells, the foundation of power begins to erode. Trump's approval rating hitting a floor of 31% is a clear signal that the public narrative has escaped his control. The exit from the courtroom was an admission that the traditional tactics of intimidation and public defiance are no longer effective against the cold reality of sworn testimony. As we look closer at the GOP fracture, we see a party divided between those who are willing to go down with the ship and those who are desperately looking for a lifeboat. The Bondi connection is particularly toxic because it involves the weaponization of the justice system, the very thing that many Republicans have accused the current administration of doing. By allegedly ordering the destruction of records, the Trump administration has made it impossible for its supporters to claim the moral high ground on issues of transparency and the rule of law. This internal hypocrisy is the fuel that is currently burning through the Republican establishment, leaving leaders with no easy answers and a rapidly closing window to save their own political careers. While the revelation of the Epstein logs and the involvement of Pam Bondi has dominated the headlines, Mark Meadows' testimony has uncovered an even more systemic threat to the American legal framework: the alleged weaponization of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At the center of this storm is Kash Patel, a figure who has long been a lightning rod for controversy regarding his proximity to Donald Trump's inner circle. According to Meadows, the former president did not just suggest a change in law enforcement priorities. He issued specific, direct orders to Patel to interfere with ongoing federal investigations. This part of the testimony paints a picture of a presidency that viewed the nation's premier law enforcement agency not as an independent body, but as a political tool designed to protect allies and target perceived enemies. Meadows testified under oath that Donald Trump issued directives to Kash Patel to freeze certain investigations and bury specific evidence that could be detrimental to the administration. This wasn't a matter of administrative oversight or a shift in policy focus. It was described by Meadows as a deliberate attempt to halt the wheels of justice in cases that threatened the president's political standing. The testimony highlights a recurring theme in this administration: the demand for absolute loyalty over constitutional duty. By placing Patel in a position of significant influence and allegedly giving him orders to suppress evidence, the administration effectively created a filter through which only favorable information could pass. This protocol, now referred to as the Patel Protocol in legal circles, represents a direct assault on the impartiality of the FBI. The implications of these orders are profound. When the director of a federal agency is allegedly instructed to freeze investigations based on political convenience, the very concept of the rule of law is called into question. Meadows' account provides a detailed look at how these orders were communicated, suggesting a level of micromanagement that bypassed traditional Department of Justice protocols. He described conversations where the former president was intensely focused on the status of specific files, demanding to know that they were safe or taken care of. This granular level of involvement suggests that the obstruction wasn't just a byproduct of the administration's style, but a core strategy of its survival. This testimony aligns perfectly with what independent observers and whistleblowers have been reporting for months. Patel has faced consistent accusations of using his position to weaponize the Bureau, and Meadows has now provided the first-hand corroboration that these actions were taken at the direct behest of the president. The fallout from this revelation has been catastrophic for the FBI's public image. Law enforcement depends on the trust of the citizens it serves, and that trust is predicated on the belief that the law is applied equally to everyone. When 74% of the American public believes that the chief of staff is telling the truth about these orders, the credibility of the entire federal law enforcement apparatus is pushed to the brink. Experts in public policy and government ethics point out that this is precisely how institutions begin to fail. It starts with the installation of loyalists in key positions, followed by the issuance of orders that prioritize the leader over the law, and culminates in the destruction of evidence and the freezing of investigations. Meadows' testimony effectively maps out this progression in chilling detail. It explains why several high-ranking officials within the Department of Justice were reportedly on the verge of resignation during this period. They weren't just dealing with a difficult boss, they were witnessing the dismantling of the American judicial system from the inside out. The political consequence of the Patel revelations is a deepening of the national divide. Supporters of the former president argue that these actions were necessary to counter a deep state that was biased against him. However, the legal reality is much more stark. Obstruction of justice and witness tampering are federal crimes regardless of the political motivation behind them. By allegedly ordering Patel to bury evidence, Donald Trump has provided prosecutors with a second front in their legal battle, one that is focused not on past actions but on the active subversion of the law while in office. The panic seen in the courtroom yesterday wasn't just about the Epstein logs. It was about the realization that the entire loyalty structure, including the protection provided by individuals like Kash Patel, has finally been exposed to the light of day. As the courtroom proceedings deepened, the testimony shifted from the destruction of documents to a far more dangerous territory: the proposed use of the United States military against the judicial branch. Mark Meadows provided a detailed account of conversations that took place behind closed doors, where the former president allegedly explored the possibility of using military force to arrest federal judges and even Supreme Court justices. This revelation represents the most severe constitutional stress test in modern American history. According to Meadows, Donald Trump viewed legal setbacks not as the functioning of a democratic system, but as acts of personal betrayal by individuals he labeled as traitors. This part of the testimony clarifies the true stakes of the current legal battle. It is a fight for the very survival of the separation of powers. Meadows testified that the rhetoric regarding the judiciary became increasingly volatile as more rulings went against the administration's interests. He described a president who was not just frustrated by the law, but one who was actively seeking ways to bypass it through raw power. The mention of a judicial hit list has sent chills through the legal community. Meadows recounted specific instances where Trump questioned why the military could not be used to round up judges who were perceived as being disloyal to the presidency. The use of the word traitors in reference to Senate-confirmed judges indicates a fundamental shift in the executive's view of the co-equal branches of government. This wasn't merely locker room talk or hyperbole. It was, according to the Chief of Staff, a serious consideration that forced military leadership into an impossible position. This testimony finally provides the necessary context for the high-profile resignation of General Schwartz last month. At the time, the three-star general cited concerns about being asked to carry out illegal orders, but he remained vague about the specifics. Meadows has now filled in those blanks, confirming that the breaking point for General Schwartz and other top military commanders was the administration's desire to weaponize the armed forces against the American judiciary. The resignation was an act of institutional preservation, a signal that the professional military would not participate in a move that would effectively end the constitutional republic. Meadows described the atmosphere at the Pentagon during this period as one of extreme alarm, with commanders quietly discussing how to uphold their oath to the Constitution in the face of direct orders that violated federal law. The implications of these revelations are staggering. If the commander-in-chief is actively seeking to arrest judges who rule against him, the judiciary ceases to be an independent check on power and becomes a hostage of the executive. This is the hallmark of a failing state, not a functioning democracy. Meadows' testimony highlights a terrifying reality. The only thing standing between the rule of law and a full-scale constitutional collapse was the integrity of a few military leaders who refused to follow illegal orders. This creates a powerful narrative arc that connects the courtroom drama to the broader health of the American Republic. It explains why the courtroom was so packed with national security reporters and why the fallout from this testimony is being felt far beyond the political circles of Washington. Public reaction to this part of the testimony has been a mix of shock and validation. For those who had warned about the erosion of democratic norms, Meadows' words are a grim confirmation of their worst fears. For supporters of the former president, it creates an uncomfortable dilemma: how to reconcile a commitment to law and order with an administration that allegedly plotted to arrest the very people responsible for upholding the law. The 74% credibility rating that Meadows currently enjoys suggests that the American people are taking these military revelations with the utmost seriousness. The data indicates that the public view of the former president as a defender of the Constitution is being systematically dismantled by the testimony of his own hand-picked chief of staff. The military situation remains a volatile component of this ongoing crisis. While General Schwartz's resignation provided a temporary release valve for the tension, the underlying issue of executive overreach remains unresolved. Meadows' testimony has opened a window into a dark chapter of American governance, where the line between political disagreement and military intervention was nearly erased. As the hearing continues, the focus now turns to who else within the military and the Department of Justice was aware of these plans. The panic and the exit we saw in the courtroom yesterday are now seen in a new light, not just as a reaction to a personal scandal, but as the reaction of a leader who knows that the most dangerous secrets of his administration, those involving the misuse of the American military, are finally being exposed to the world. The transition from a political scandal to a formal criminal prosecution has moved with unprecedented speed following the events in Judge Moss's courtroom. While the public is focused on the drama of a former president fleeing a hearing, legal experts at the Department of Justice are focused on a much more concrete reality: the elements of a federal indictment. Mark Meadows has provided something that prosecutors have spent years searching for: direct eyewitness testimony that bridges the gap between intent and action. The Burn It All order is no longer just a shocking headline. It is now the cornerstone of a potential multi-count indictment for obstruction of justice under Title 18 of the United States Code. To understand the severity of this legal reckoning, one must look at the specific nature of obstruction. Under federal law, The destruction of documents during an ongoing investigation is a felony. Meadows' testimony that Donald Trump personally ordered the destruction of records related to the Epstein logs is the smoking gun that removes the defense of plausible deniability. In previous cases, the former president could argue that staff members acted on their own or that documents were lost through administrative errors. However, Meadows has placed the order directly in the mouth of the president. When combined with Pam Bondi's previous admissions of unlawful acts, the prosecution now has a corroborated chain of evidence that is extremely difficult to break. Beyond obstruction, the revelations regarding the military and the judiciary open the door for charges of witness tampering and conspiracy against rights. If the Department of Justice can prove that the administration actively sought to intimidate or arrest federal judges to influence the outcome of legal proceedings, it represents a criminal assault on the judicial process itself. Legal analysts suggest that the special counsel is currently evaluating a strategy to combine these various threads into a comprehensive racketeering case. This would frame the administration's actions not as a series of isolated mistakes, but as a coordinated criminal enterprise designed to subvert the rule of law and maintain power through illegal means. The timing of the potential indictments is now the subject of intense debate within the Justice Department. There is a clear tension between the need for immediate legal accountability and the desire to avoid the appearance of election interference. As noted in the reports, prosecutors are weighing whether to move forward before or after the upcoming midterm elections. One prevailing theory is that the DOJ will split the difference, announcing the formal conclusion of certain investigations now to satisfy the public's right to know, while holding the formal indictments until immediately after the votes are cast. This strategy aims to insulate the department from accusations of partisanship while ensuring that the legal consequences remain unavoidable. The personal legal exposure for Donald Trump has never been higher. By fleeing the courtroom, he may have inadvertently strengthened the prosecution's hand. Judge Moss has already indicated that this behavior will be factored into rulings regarding character and credibility. In the eyes of the law, an exit during incriminating testimony can be interpreted as a consciousness of guilt. Every time a new detail of the Meadows testimony is verified by independent evidence, such as the logs from the FBI or the records of phone calls to the Attorney General's office, the legal trap tightens. The 31% approval rating and the 74% credibility score for Meadows are not just political metrics, they are indicators of a potential jury pool's mindset. If the majority of the country already finds the chief of staff more believable than the president, the defense faces an uphill battle in any future trial. The legal reckoning is no longer a distant possibility. It is an active, unfolding process. As the special counsel's office continues to process the data provided by Meadows, the focus is shifting from what happened to who will be held accountable first. The exit from the courtroom was just the beginning of a long legal journey that may lead to the most significant criminal trial in American history. The sight of a chief of staff testifying against his president is perhaps the most visceral image of a collapsing administration. To understand why Mark Meadows, a man who once described himself as a shield for the president, decided to provide the testimony that triggered a courtroom panic, one must look at the cold, transactional nature of loyalty in the modern political era. This is not just a story about one man changing his mind. It is a study in the anatomy of betrayal. For Meadows, the decision to flip was likely not born out of a sudden moral awakening, but rather a brutal calculation of self-preservation. When the legal protections of the presidency began to dissolve, the cost of loyalty simply became higher than the cost of the truth. History has shown that loyalty within the Trump inner circle often operates as a one-way street. From Michael Cohen to Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon, the pattern is consistent. Individuals who provide absolute loyalty eventually find themselves facing legal and financial ruin without the reciprocal protection of the man they served. Meadows, an astute political operator, watched this pattern repeat for years. He saw how the former president would distance himself from allies the moment they became legal liabilities. By the time Meadows was facing multiple federal charges with no shield of immunity, the Michael Cohen precedent became a warning he could no longer ignore. He realized that in the final act of this legal drama, he was either going to be a witness or a scapegoat. The psychological impact of this betrayal on the administration cannot be overstated. When the person who managed your daily schedule, sat in your most private meetings, and carried out your most sensitive orders decides to cooperate with federal prosecutors, the feeling of safety vanishes. This explains the visible panic and the subsequent exit from the courtroom. It was the realization that there are no more secrets. Meadows knows where the files were kept, who was on the other end of the phone calls, and exactly what was meant by the instruction to burn it all. This level of intimacy makes him the ultimate insider threat to the defense, turning every past conversation into a potential piece of evidence. This shift in loyalty has created a domino effect within the Republican establishment. If Mark Meadows, the keeper of the keys, is no longer willing to hold the line, why should anyone else? We are now seeing a climate of intense paranoia within the remaining inner circle. Everyone is looking at everyone else, wondering who is wearing a wire or who has already signed an immunity deal with Jack Smith. This internal collapse of trust is often more damaging to an administration than the legal charges themselves. It paralyzes decision-making and leads to the kind of erratic public behavior, like fleeing a courtroom, that further erodes the president's standing with the public. Public data suggests that the American people understand this dynamic perfectly. The 74% credibility rating for Meadows indicates that the public views his testimony as a confession rather than a betrayal. In the eyes of the majority, Meadows is not a villain for talking. He is a witness to a crime that they already suspected was happening. The former president's approval rating of 31% reflects a public that is exhausted by the cycle of loyalty and litigation. They are watching the people who were once the loudest defenders of the administration now become its most credible accusers. Ultimately, the Meadows betrayal is a referendum on the leadership style of Donald Trump. A leadership built on personal fealty rather than institutional duty is inherently fragile. It works as long as the leader can offer protection, but the moment that protection fails, the system of loyalty collapses. Meadows' decision to flip was the final acknowledgement that the power of the presidency is not absolute, and that the law eventually catches up to everyone. As he continues his testimony, the focus is not just on what he says, but on who will be the next to realize that the loyalty they were promised was never a two-way street. While the legal battles play out inside a silent courtroom, the political consequences are exploding across the American landscape. The testimony of Mark Meadows has done more than just create a legal crisis. It has fundamentally altered the public's perception of the former administration. For years, the political strength of Donald Trump was built on a foundation of perceived strength and the belief that the system was being unfairly weaponized against him. However, the data coming out in the wake of the Meadows revelations suggests that this narrative is finally reaching a breaking point. The American public is no longer just watching a political fight. They are rendering a verdict on the integrity of the presidency itself. The statistical data is perhaps the most devastating evidence of this shift. Recent polling indicates that Donald Trump's national approval rating has crashed to a historic low of just 31%. To put this in perspective, this is lower than the approval rating of Richard Nixon in the days immediately preceding his resignation. Even more telling is the credibility gap. A staggering 74% of Americans now state that they find the testimony of Mark Meadows to be credible. This includes a significant portion of independent voters and even a growing segment of the Republican base. When 3/4 of the country believes your former chief of staff over your own denials, the ability to lead effectively vanishes. This shift in public sentiment is creating a state of absolute panic within the Republican Party as the midterm elections approach. Candidates who once scrambled for a Trump endorsement are now finding that his support has become a political liability. In swing districts across the country, Republican representatives are quietly removing the former president's name from their campaign literature and avoiding joint appearances. The Meadows testimony, particularly the revelations regarding the destruction of evidence and the proposed use of the military, has provided Democratic opponents with a goldmine of campaign material. Every Republican candidate will now be forced to answer a simple but devastating question. Do you stand with the law or do you stand with a leader who allegedly ordered evidence to be burned? Political analysts are predicting that the upcoming midterms could be a bloodbath for the GOP if the current trend continues. House seats that were previously considered safe are now in play, and several key Senate races are tilting toward the Democrats. The Trump fatigue factor has reached an all-time high. Voters are reporting a sense of exhaustion with the constant cycle of courtroom drama, betrayals, and constitutional crises. For the crucial middle-of-the-road voter, The choice is becoming less about policy and more about a desire for stability and the rule of law. The image of the president fleeing a courtroom while his own right-hand man testifies against him has become the defining visual of the campaign season. Furthermore, the impact is being felt at the state and local levels. Governors and state legislators are finding that the national chaos is drowning out their local messages. The fracture within the GOP is no longer a quiet disagreement. It is an open civil war. You have the loyalist wing of the party attacking Meadows as a traitor, while the pragmatic wing is desperately trying to salvage the party's future. This internal conflict is draining resources, confusing donors, and demoralizing the base. The lack of a unified message is a gift to the opposition, allowing them to frame the election as a referendum on the very survival of American democratic institutions. As we look toward the final weeks of the campaign, the question is no longer whether the Meadows testimony will have an impact, but how deep the damage will go. The 31% approval floor suggests that the MAGA movement is shrinking to its most hardened core, leaving the rest of the electorate to search for a new direction. The walls aren't just closing in on Donald Trump legally, they are closing in on his political movement. The exit from the courtroom was more than a personal retreat. It may have been the moment the Trump era officially lost its grip on the American majority. As the dust begins to settle on one of the most chaotic days in the history of the American legal system, the image that remains burned into the public consciousness is not the testimony itself, but the empty chair where a president once sat. The exit of Donald Trump from Judge Moss's courtroom marks a definitive turning point in the relationship between the executive branch and the judiciary. It was a moment where the theater of politics finally collided with the cold reality of sworn testimony. We are no longer discussing hypothetical walls closing in or partisan theories. We are witnessing the systematic dismantling of a power structure that believed it was beyond the reach of the law. The burn-it-all order, once a whispered command in the halls of the White House, has become the epitaph of an era defined by secrecy and the subversion of institutional norms. Looking forward, the legal calendar is now set for a series of high-stakes proceedings that will dominate the national conversation for months to come. Mark Meadows is no longer just a former staffer. He is the star witness in a dozen different federal and state cases. His cooperation deal ensures that every major decision, every attempt to interfere with law enforcement, and every effort to destroy evidence will be examined under the harsh light of a courtroom. The upcoming trials will not just be about Donald Trump, they will be about the accountability of everyone involved, from Bondi to Kash Patel. The era of impunity has ended, replaced by a rigorous process of discovery and judgment that will test the very foundations of the Constitution. The future of the American Republic now rests on the ability of its institutions to finish what was started in that courtroom. While the political fallout may lead to a bloodbath in the midterms and a total realignment of the GOP, the legal outcome is what will truly define the legacy of this moment. If the evidence provided by Meadows leads to convictions for obstruction of justice and witness tampering, it will send a clear message to all future leaders. The office of the presidency is a temporary trust, not a shield for criminal activity. The rule of law has proven to be more resilient than the personality of any individual, and the bravery of those who chose to testify, regardless of their past actions, has provided the country with a path back to transparency. For the American people, this is a moment for deep reflection. The fact that 74% of the country believes the chief of staff over the president is a sign of a deeply damaged social contract, but it is also a sign of a public that is still capable of recognizing the truth when it is presented with facts. As this story continues to move with lightning speed, the need for independent, non-corporate analysis has never been greater. We are committed to bringing you the facts, the context, and the raw truth behind the headlines, without the spin of the mainstream media. The world is watching to see if the American system of checks and balances can survive this ultimate stress test, and we will be here every step of the way to document the outcome. In the final analysis, the burn-it-all order failed because the truth is not something that can be easily incinerated. It lives in the records, it lives in the memory of those who were in the room, and eventually, it finds its way into the light of a federal courtroom. Donald Trump may have fled the room, but he cannot flee the history that is currently being written. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive analysis. If you believe in the importance of the rule of law and the search for the truth, hit the like button and subscribe to stay informed. This is the end of the chapter, but the trial of the century is only just beginning.